Welcome to another episode of the Chris, Rod, Max Show, the show about the impact of AI in your organization and what it means for the world. And as usual, I'm joined by my co-host. Hi, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Good to be back.
And Max. Hello, Max.
Hello. It's good to be back.
And in this week's show, the main topic is the costs and implication of running AI startups and AI initiatives in your organization. The topic that said this is that Salesforce, we'll know it, the CRM, so SaaS company, pretty much like the company that started the SaaS revolution, well, pretty much more than 20 years ago, is announcing, according to its founder, Mark Benioff, that it is becoming an AI agents company. What are AI agents? These are tools powered by AI that act autonomously. In the case of Salesforce, for example, if I have a list of contacts that I want to reach, instead of me doing this manually, I can just say, reach out to the next 10 contacts that most likely will engage with me in the next, let's say, like 2 weeks and so on. And we're seeing this. It seems it might be driven by the markets, that they are not really reacting to Salesforce AI initiatives. But on that matter, so here, Max, what do you think? So Salesforce, AI agents, do you think this will excite the markets? How do you see that?
Thank you very much for the question. I think the way I think about AI agents is almost like a eventual development of where we have software today. So for example, within Salesforce, you have multiple different functions, and those different functions will eventually each of them turn into one smaller agent. So I can give an example that I can think of. Some time ago, when I was working for a software company, basically selling enterprise software to banks, we use Salesforce as a CRM, as in your sales folks use them. But my role back then was more on the product side, which I work a lot with the sales ops team to try to understand what are the different data that are coming in. So then we will have to go into Salesforce to create those dashboards to basically understand, as a product manager, where are people swaying? What are the different inputs that are coming in? So there will be a person that go in and try to drag those data out, create the a dashboard so that they don't have to recreate again. But I can think of this, with I would say agents, you don't need the person to do that. It's the whole idea of getting an agent and tell them, right, can you go run X amount of data for me? And they will just pull it from Salesforce. So the way, I guess, agents work in my head is basically mini software within a larger software, and they will do smaller little tasks for me. And I think the world is going to turn into that. It's because we already have a lot of software. So you were just trying to figure out, breaking down all the smaller feature, and can they do one small task for me for this specific instance? What do you think?
Well, what I'm thinking about this is not only in this matter of also like you working on the product and something related to like the topic of agents in an organization, but I'm also thinking in the topic of keeping these innovators in place. For example, that you say, hey, I just developed these insights and knowledge, and now I'll go and then do my startup, which actually happened to Salesforce, where in 2016, they did a acquisition. So MetaMind with Richard Zucker, he is a very well-known name in the space of AI. But then in 2020, he left to do his own company called U.com, like a Perplexity one. And here, Chris, I'm thinking for large companies who want to retain talent, who, for example, having running an acquisition spree in order to say, hey, let's bring innovation. Let's have all these AI analytic driven minds in our company to bring it to the next level. But then all of a sudden, for these founders, it's more interesting to go and do their own new companies instead of staying in the organization. What do you advise to them? How can they maybe like keep this talent, or what can they do in order to at least keep the knowledge that these people are taking with them?
Honestly speaking, I think money always attracts talents. So I'm sure like a pay raise will definitely help. But I think there are different components here, right? And when I look at this interesting article around Salesforce, I think we just talked about agents. I think it's a very technical term because, at least from a user perspective, really what you try to do is you try to avoid menial tasks. You try to avoid having to do manual tasks that are repetitive. But I think what really the challenge is, and this is not the first time we talk about it, is the interface. It's like, how do you make that happen? And I honestly think this is the right time for all product managers. And I'm sure we will see quite a few rising up to figure out building on the old world, maybe let's say a Salesforce environment. How do you build on top that layer of features? How do you integrate it with, clients that are also really old school, right? We talked about Deutsche Bahn before that are looking for an MS-DOS engineer. Like that's the kind of reality we're faced with today. And now you have this transition plan where larger organizations, tech companies, Salesforce, for example, are now trying to bridge between the older world and them, building on a very, let's say, fragmented, but also very old kind of IT landscape, and sort of like building features, AI capabilities on top of it, but doing so in a way that also enables you to become the future. And I think the article was also very interesting when it comes to innovation, right? And it says, okay, well, Salesforce used to be a startup. Now it got really big. And now they're trying to infuse this startup mentality, AI mentality into the company again. But it's so difficult. And I mean, that's the reason why we see, this innovator's dilemma where new entrants come in and they take over the game, right? And in this particular case with Salesforce, a CRM system that is built on maybe newer tech is definitely HubSpot. And we do see that HubSpot has also become very large already with a lot of functionalities, but also taking away quite a bit of business from Salesforce. So I think that's really what we need to navigate, or what every company needs to navigate. So not only how do we keep talent that we need, I think it's also about attracting new talents, new product managers that can actually help to bridge between these different worlds. But then again, also, how do you infuse this startup-y kind of mentality to change, which is obviously something we all don't want. It's like we're all very resistant. And at the same time, acquiring companies that are bringing in new technologies, and how do you bring that together? I think that's really the challenge we're facing or companies and organizations are faced with.
And in many cases, for established organizations, we have a situation where there is already like some defensibility, a moat in terms of data they have accumulated. So over decades, in the case of Salesforce, well, all the companies that they are using Salesforce, they have all their company data, sales data, commercial data, they're inside. And Max, do you think that gives them a head start, or will you say like a scraping new entrant, let's say like some AI first CRM will have an edge, given that they're built from the ground up for AI, where Salesforce is this clunky interface that is hard to navigate and nobody really understands how to do things inside because it's now so complicated?
I think data definitely plays a big fuel for the larger companies. I think especially for companies like Salesforce, they're in some of the most complex companies. So the workflows, the know-how, the ability to, I guess, identify those steps are very important. So I think when it comes to like core system of record, I think it's not very different, right? It's just ultimately a database of information. But the Salesforce workflow to me is quite interesting, which plays into the question, or should I say the point that Chris raises around UX and UI. How do you interface with that? So for example, you would have create a process around a sales method that you want to use, and there will be some idiosyncratic steps and workflow that you would have taken. How can you then install an agent within that process? Or do people need to then redesign their entire process in order to fit that agent in? So those knowledge to me is important. And the reason why it's important is because it will then change how your AI model will be deployed internally. There might be small little menial tasks, but when do you interface those small menial tasks? It's basically a question that can only be answered by some of the organizations out there. So I think having those knowledge is super important, and being able to then train your AI models with those knowledge, I think will give them a head start. If not down the line, can be a differentiating point. At least that's how I think about it.
So we're establishing here the UI, UX, important, data, of course, also important how this head start. And now comes the topic of like capital and the differentiation, where this brings me to our second article connected to that is how AI startups are struggling to keep with big tech. This comes from Bloomberg, where they're saying that, for example, Aleph Alpha, we have spoken about Aleph Alpha on this show. They raised more than 500 million just last November. But now they're announcing that they're shifting away from building advanced AI systems. And they're quoting their CEO, Jonas Andrulli, saying, the world changed. Just having an European LLM, large language model, is not sufficient as a business model. it doesn't justify the investment. So European companies historically, they have tried to set this differentiation around data, around privacy, around we are different than the US and so on. But we're seeing that even for a company such as Aleph Alpha, this doesn't seem to be enough. It doesn't seem to be a compelling argument for like potential buyers to choose Aleph Alpha over, let's say, like an OpenAI. What does this mean? So for example, a company who is trying to differentiate itself, what can be angles that the company can have? Or for example, is the European angle still a good one, but maybe the company was not able to exploit it enough?
I mean, I think we need to look at different layers here, right? We talk about the large language models, the basic of infrastructure level when it comes to artificial intelligence. And I think the models in itself, again, to develop those, we've spoken about it quite a bit already, is quite expensive from a energy perspective, data acquisition perspective, but also just for a compute perspective. But then again, I think there are different layers. And Rod, actually, I think you can better explain on where you can actually build in and bake in security and policies, etc., which I think you can also develop within the application layer. And I think this is sort of like how you can differentiate yourself. I think when it comes to this article, it is, in my opinion, and having been in the innovation space for such a long time, almost a decade, I just think this is a very unique moment now, because as the article is also telling us, it's quite expensive for all startups to actually build AI, especially the foundational models, to the extent that maybe this is really the first time actually where I think where corporates and startups collaborate is a huge opportunity and advantage. And I think we, at least in Europe and in Germany, we had this like wave of, oh, let's, bring both worlds together sometime in 2010 or 14, when I think there was a major push into fintech and into digital payments. But now I think it's a bit different because, or not even different, but like even larger in terms of opportunity, is because bigger companies and corporates do have the capital that they can deploy. And then in a startup, you normally have very entrepreneurial minds and very like tech savvy people. And if you were to bring that together, that's really probably a good way forward when it comes to being an AI startup or being a corporate trying to be innovative. And I do believe that we see these kind of examples now in the market, right? I mean, look at, OpenAI now collaborating or having Microsoft as one of their LPs. I think any major AI innovator these days actually need that kind of capital injection provider. And if it's not VC, then definitely it's the corporates. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was thinking on the topic of you were saying that we have to differentiate between, so here, the foundational models, that's like the lowest layer in the application stack of an AI company. And then what you're describing at this application layer that it will be building on top of that. So for example, Aleph Alpha, they have raised 500 million, but they're trying to build these foundational models. So it might not be that every company needs their own model. But also the article quotes about Character AI. Character AI is a startup that what tries to do is to create individual personas using AI. For example, let's say you want to chat with Elon Musk, or you say, hey, I need a psychologist, or I need a virtual friend. Character AI provides these personas so that you can engage with them and have virtual friends online. And they're also struggling because larger competitors, OpenAI, etc., they are including this functionality directly into their platforms. They're baking them into the model itself or into their offering. And as a result, it's becoming harder to differentiate yourself. So here, for example, it is quoted that companies need at least to spend for a GPU, for a good GPU, $30,000, right? So then in a fair hand, it sounds odd. 30,000 for a company is not that much. But at the same time, when we think that they might need hundreds of them, here, Max, to you, how can a company get these capital expenditures? How do you justify it, and what are the options? Especially, for example, you might not have access to like public markets. If you're, for example, like a larger startup or scale up, what are your options here?
I think to your point, just to answer your question around, I guess, the capital source, at the moment, or should I say, for the past 20 years or so, or 30, 40 years or so, a lot of software funded by venture capitalists, sometimes by corporates that, have a little bit more foresight, like Salesforce Ventures, technically still a venture capital, but, with the corporate I think what I have in my mind is around the economics of AI. So traditionally about software, the idea is that you pull a huge amount of investment up front and eventually there will be no marginal costs down the line, which means you build all your software up once and you'll be able to resell it many, many times. So, however, with AI, it seems to haven't reached that point yet. So you could continuously pull a huge amount of money to build the model, but then you still have a lot of capital expenditure that you have that you eventually need to amortize over time that eventually hits into however much that you're still spending. I guess my question in my head is, at what point will it change from that inflection point? So how long do I need to develop an AI model in order to be able to get the returns that I would like to have, which means with a lower or non-existent marginal cost? I felt that given that it has changed, I do not know where that line is yet at the moment. Hence, you have to continuously tap into the bigger capital sources. So you have your venture capitalists, your governments, right? I would say, like we talked about Mistral last week, like France is doing a great job, trying to pour capital into helping AI startups to grow. That's one. The other way to do, it's probably more of a technical challenge. Is there a way to lower the cost of developing all these AI models? At least the world is currently telling us no, but I guess it's just good to think about what could be the alternative. So my general sense is either you go find someone with a lot of money like America, or you find a different way of doing things, which means you could build a smaller model with a cheaper rate, but then give you a return quicker so that you can use that to fund your model. Almost like the Tesla strategy, right? You build like a very expensive Tesla to sell it to someone, and eventually you have enough capital to produce, a cheaper Tesla for the world. So can you do that for models? I don't know. What do you think on different approaches to building AI models?
What come to mind was, and now that you were bringing to the topic of France, and so here for Chris, it is that, Chris, I know that you are very active in the APAC region. So the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, was quoted saying that today it costs to do a model around $100 million to train it and so on. But he says that right now this is just the start. Expected cost just by next year is to be, will be hitting around 1 billion, and potentially by 2025, 2026, it will get towards 5 or 10 billion. And in the APAC region, it's unheard this type of so let's say, hey, I need 10 billion to do this type of scientific undertakings and so on. So what does this mean for other regions that are outside the US? And for example, now with your insights from APAC, so does it mean that it will be pretty much just the US and China that can provide this infrastructure for everyone else? Or do you see possibilities still for like regional players to arise?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, right? I mean, that's why US and China are the biggest countries when it comes to innovation. And I think it's for good reasons, not only because you have good talents, but also the capital required. I mean, I do think that the Middle East can play, and I think they are. Obviously, I don't know exactly. I'm not very much familiar with the region, but definitely they have the capital. But I haven't heard of any like large language model coming out of the Middle East. I suppose they rather invest into US and China capabilities. And honestly speaking, it's also not, you can like just come up with talents and just develop something. I think one of the articles that we we are speaking about today really compared this to the race of shared bikes. Remember, guys, like back in 2016, 17 at least, in China, that was like a huge thing where you saw companies like Mobike, Ofo, and some of the other players pop up out of nowhere trying to race for a shared bike kind of expansion. And actually, when I thought about this, I don't think this is really true for the AI race that we're seeing right now. I think what we do see is that lots of AI players have started. Obviously it always starts with like a lot of fragmentation, but I think we see much faster in this market now the kind of consolidation, right? And that's also because it is so expensive. And so lots of startups are actually rethinking, is it really worth it to go in it? And especially now we live in a world where actually profitability matters, right? It's not like 10 years ago where, Uber can like just burn money and money and money. And it's just about growth, right? So I think that's why we see that kind of speed of consolidation when it comes to AI models. However, I actually truly believe that there's so much more potential also on the application layer. I mean, again, I think we have not cracked the nut yet on how can corporates and enterprises really adopt to AI, and is it really a monopoly that bigger tech companies have, like the Nvidias and Microsofts, to really build that kind of enterprise capability, or actually will there be startups that are also serving B2B enterprises, maybe SMEs, with AI capabilities?
Yes, indeed, that's the case. And different to like a quote also in the article. So of course you can tap foreign sources and so on, and then the main companies are building. But for example, so the Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, he claims that he sees that a lot of companies are actually overbuilding. But the argument is that either you overinvest now, maybe you become a little bit irrational, and so maybe put more money than you should, but then you risk being left behind 10 to 15 years if you're not doing this. And what are you seeing, Max, in this space? Are you seeing that companies are actually indeed overbuilding, overinvesting? For example, now that we see that so companies need billions to develop something. So OpenAI, for example, is now raising 100 billion in order to like stay relevant in the market, come with new developments and so on. When we look at those companies that are in the application layer, are you seeing that companies are really overinvesting in the AI space? Are they overbuilding? Or are they taking a more cautious approach and seeing what works, what doesn't, and trying things step by step?
I think it depends on which corporate you go to. There are some corporates that are definitely going head on. But as we all know, when we say overbuilding, it's not just momentarily deploying a lot of resources, but also doing it consistently over time. I don't think we have given that enough time to see who is truly committed on AI yet, because every AI program can be shut down 2 years. It's the same argument that people talk about venture capital, corporate venture capital. Lifespan of a corporate venture capital is 3 to 4 years because the guy decided to leave and therefore gone. So the same idea, I don't think we have seen the longevity of some of at least the latest Gen AI model yet. That's one. So to answer your question around whether or not they're over investing, I don't think that we're throwing money on AI without looking at use cases, because corporates are really focused on the returns that they can generate from AI. So the question then becomes is, can they sustain that losses over time so that they eventually can see the light at the end of the tunnel? Let's say it might take 4 years, 5 years, but they still continuously invest. I don't know if that will happen. So we will just have to see in the next 2-3 years whether or not some of these programs continue to be where they are. So that's one. Number two, I think the over investing, I was just having this conversation with a colleague, the over investing, the irrational exuberance, especially when it comes to innovation economy, it's almost a feature, not a bug. You will need to invest so that you can keep building. Everyone will just keep trying things. And you will realize that eventually there will be a path that works better compared to others. And either people pivot or they die. But that's part of capitalism, no? Like you just get weed out. It's like, great, let's go again. So for me, in my head, like I do agree with, I guess, Mark Zuckerberg's sentiment, right? It's better to just overinvest. You can get it wrong. But at least you try and you will learn something and you'll go again. And also, I guess, reminds me of like Amazon. Now they're a giant corporate, right? When they talk about Fire Phone, I think Jeff Bezos always say like they're going to make more investment or bigger mistakes compared to Fire Phone. Hence, in my head, it's almost a feature, not a bug. Which means, as innovators, we don't really care more about over-investing, but just keep building, which kind of just very reflective of the current climate for AI with the amount of billions that are pouring in.
Yes, and on one side is the topic of over-investing, but also the other one is, let's say, this bang for your buck, what you're getting for your money. And this brings me to our next article from the Financial Times, which says that the NVIDIA AI chips are cheaper to rent in the US than in China than in the US. which is a bit surprising, but still we have been discussing in previous shows how there are all these local initiatives about AI in a box that's very cost effective and so on. And this was with local vendors, local manufacturers. But here we see that Financial Times is claiming that NVIDIA chips, for example, can be rented by local providers in China for around $6 an hour, compared to, for example, $10 an hour in the US for the same setup. And well, here we have the implications of one side costs, but also, for example, like geopolitics, also, for example, the topic of like data privacy and so on. And I'm wondering here, Chris, when you're talking to startups, do they have like a framework how to navigate this and say, hey, actually, it's very, very cheap to do it in China. Let's just go and find a provider there, or they're trying to have some other considerations. How are startups making decisions where to allocate the resources and where to find the infrastructure and the vendors for this infrastructure?
Honestly speaking, I think this is a geopolitical dynamic. And in general, I think this, what you just described, will benefit the domestic market in China to develop AI services and products. I think in general, the sentiment that I hear from startups is, oh, we try to avoid China just at all costs, just simply because you never know with your data, you never know with regulations, you never know how predictable, unpredictable China is. And I think that's just in general the sentiment over the last couple of years. So when we think about this particular case here with chips being rented cheaper than in the US, I think this doesn't come as a surprise to me, honestly, just simply because of all costs, total costs of chip rental. I mean, whatever flows into that is obviously also cheaper, much cheaper in China than in the US. But when it comes to availability and proliferation of NVIDIA chips, of course, this is definitely something that will benefit domestic local players within the market. I mean, when I worked in an AI startup, and literally we were using computer visioning to provide a service, and we were expanding into China, I think this was a very ad hoc, or let's say opportunistic opportunity to really look at the China market, because obviously China is this huge market. If you were to capture just 0.1%, that's more than any other markets you can actually generate that kind of revenue. Yet at the same time, it was just very difficult to build in China, just simply because China just works on a different internet model. You can't really use Google or Facebook or any other services you would normally build upon. So we had to make the decision, okay, are we going to go full localize and really replicate everything from AWS to Ali Cloud, other providers of services, in order to replicate the service and product over there? And I think there were big concerns in terms of data, in terms of privacy. I think this only has increased over the last year. So in general, I think startups tend to avoid China, especially when it comes to operationally. And in terms of target market, only the ones that really have a strong value proposition and it makes sense. And normally that sits within retail or pharmaceuticals.
If we, let's say, like abstract a little bit this and think about, so the decision between a cheaper provider or a better, well-known one, how are companies deciding that? So for example, Max, when you have, like, for example, a startup coming to you and saying, hey, we're providing this service and we are, let's say, 20% cheaper than Amazon Web Services, or we're 30% cheaper than Google, do you say, hey, this is exciting because they are much more affordable? Or you think, hey, actually, I prefer to stick to Amazon, I prefer to use Microsoft because these are like the names we know. As the usual old saying goes, nobody got fired for buying IBM. So what's the current thinking in large organizations?
I think the latter definitely still prevails. There's always a chance of being fired, especially in this current climate, if you make a wrong step. At least in most of the, I would say, normal corporate, if you will, right? You can't compare that to, I don't know, big tech, for example, because I give an example of a Fire Phone, because Amazon's previous gentleman that I can't remember his name now, the executive that looks after Fire Phone, he wasn't fired after Fire Phone failed. In fact, he was given a bigger mandate to go try something else. But I don't think that exists so much in other corporates, at least. So coming back to your question, specifically around, the trade-off between costs as well as other considerations in larger corporates, the cost thing will always exist. There's always there. But the bigger question that a lot of corporates are asking, what are the bigger opportunities here? Because for at least for the last 10 years, they have been battered. Like, some corporates are just too short term, and, some corporates are, not thinking about the long term, not investing enough. Therefore, their lunch will get eaten by startups or smaller tech companies. In the case of banks, they say big tech are coming in, taking on all the retail business, yada yada. So I think corporate executives today, they're not dumb, nor are they blind or deaf. They are thinking about investing in long term, but they just have to, I guess, balance it out and be able to convince their investor community they are doing the right thing. So it's almost like, it's telling a story from top down, because your CEO will go out there and say that, we're continuously investing in long term. And then your internal, MDs or Ds, they're running the company, the managers will still have to think about, okay, for long term, what makes more sense? What are the biggest bang for buck that we talk about? At least, that's the prevailing thinking in larger corporates. And also, I think we mentioned this before previously, with corporates, it's always a bell curve decision making process, with x-axis being, I would say, success, and then y-axis being, the different types of bets, I suppose, whichever way you think about it. And the bell curve is, they would rather invest in things that higher probability of success, but, lower return, but more tangible, or should I say more predictable, as compared to investing in something less predictable, but has outsized return. Simply because it's just the time it takes, the way you would eventually be able to convince someone else to give you the capital to do that is also quite hard. So hence the cost point will be there. But the decision-making process within corporate hasn't really changed much. It's just they have decided to, sometimes invest in the longer term, trying to do things slightly differently. But they probably, if they're not in their space, they probably won't be the first one jumping in. For example, like if Microsoft don't jump into AI head first, a lot of larger corporate probably wouldn't pick up AI immediately. That's at least how I've seen it at the moment.
The risk of here being fired, and so we're having here a situation where even staying on the application layer and saying, hey, we're not building our own large language models in our organization, where we'll just build on top. We're seeing that this requires still a significant investment. So, Chris, do you have any frameworks or decision-making process that executives can use in order to decide between, or how to mitigate this risk of saying, hey, I want to be innovative, I want to bring this innovation into my organization, and maybe start some AI initiatives on my AI project, but at the same time, we'll have a way to reduce the risk of saying, I have here to take maybe like quite some millions, use them into a project that has unknown return on investment, unknown impact, and potentially might fail. And still, I don't want to be in a situation where they tell me, hey, you just use 10, 20, 50 million into this, it fails, so thank you, but you have to go and leave.
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the company, honestly speaking. I mean, if we talk about an SME or a corporate, I mean, generally speaking, IT, I mean, that's where definitely AI in, that perspective sits in. IT is always a difficult animal because, you touch upon core systems, depending on the industry, very critical systems even. And obviously to innovate around that is very difficult just simply because it's so protected. So normally, I would say, if we think about a strategy, I think or a framework, I think there are different aspects we should always look at, right? So generally speaking, what's your strategy? How much do you want to invest? What's sort of the attitude of whatever decision board or governance system looks at AI? Is it going to be a key priority? Is it not? I think that's sort of like the first question to ask, right? Then the second is obviously also what field, like where do you want to employ it? Like how is this going to benefit everyone? Then there are things like obviously talent. Do you have the talents? Where do you actually want to source the talents? What's your organizational structure and operating model? So I think those questions, it's not really like a different kind of framework. Every time you try to like bring in a new technology or innovation, you will have to answer these questions. I think when it comes to IT in particular, normally people try to avoid going into the core systems, but rather find some kind of way around. So either through like an innovation center, or with like maybe a smaller business unit, or maybe with a smaller team even, to try out something. Build the case, build the pilot, build the evidence that it's a good technology, that the vendor is a good one. Normally, also, if you think about external technologies, you would do some tendering, you would shortlist, long list, and then shortlist some suppliers of certain technologies, and then run a pilot. And I think this is reality, and this is how normally new innovation comes into a company.
And so you're being here this topic of pretty much, let's say, trying to mitigate by looking at different possibilities of maybe different teams, maybe different business units, maybe like explore the market and so on. And historically, for any organization, when they're making a buying decision, they look, for example, at Gartner, or they will talk to consultants and so on. But in the world of AI, in order to choose an AI model, what might be the right model for my copilot, for my assistant, and so on? Well, the whole industry is relying on a benchmark called LMCs. And so TechCrunch had an interesting article this week about the shortcomings or maybe challenges and problems that LMCs faces as really this single source of truth. And I wonder here, so Max, when we're thinking about making buying decisions in the traditional world of IT in large enterprises, I just look at what Gartner says, and based on that, I make this buying decision. Now, Gartner doesn't really have anything about this, and we are all relying on a benchmark that, it's almost like a university project, and it's also unclear sometimes why some models rank the way they do, and so on and so forth. Do companies have here alternatives? What can they do? Is their only source of truth just using this benchmark, or can they do something else in order to make these decisions on where to invest, what model to choose, and so on?
So, good question. I guess first response would be, Rod, when are you building your own LMSys? If you need an alternative, right? Maybe someone should try building something different. I guess when it comes to scoring certain things, it has always been quite subjective. And even till today, let's say financial services data, which is what I understand the most, like Reuters will come up with the league table versus Bloomberg versus FactSet, and you will just have multiple different ways of looking at a single set of data. I think it's always helpful to have alternative to basically just trying to understand why is something different compared to the other. That's just best practices, right? It's just really to make your understanding more robust. And to your question, how do then corporates will test those models? They will actually deploy it and try it. A lot of, I would say, corporates that are doing AI today are really just trying out different models, trying to figure out which model is better for specific use case that they are likely to go for. And the whole idea here is that eventually they will find, the best model that will help them. I think for larger corporate that has the ability, the talent, the time, the capital to do that, that's what they do. For smaller corporate or mid-sized corporate, I think that's where the challenge, will become, there will be more challenges to do that internally, which then they will rely on external consultants to do that. So you would see that, the rise of different types of consultants. For example, I can think of an instant like cybersecurity. Like a lot of larger corporates, larger banks, they all have their own CISO. They have some good knowledge. They probably went from one place to another, probably built that knowledge up. But if those CISO don't move from, let's say, these larger corporates to smaller mid-size, sometimes they rely on external consultants to be able to support that. And today, that is still true in the cybersecurity space because it's so technical. It's quite hard to understand. You sometimes really need someone who truly understand a subsegment of cybersecurity, which is relevant for that corporate. You will still rely on some external knowledge. So I think for corporates that do not have the knowledge to eventually vet out this type of models, they will eventually rely on someone to be able to do that. So either there's always two ways, right? Either you build up knowledge internally or you get someone outside in to help you with that. even if it's momentarily.
And so benchmarks are only important, or they provide pretty much a variety and help us make decisions. But the question is, are companies really exploring different vendors? Are they really exploring what are their options? When you talk to companies, Chris, what are you hearing? Are people saying, hey, I want to test this vendor, I want them to see how it works and so on? Or do they instinctively flock into, let's say, like OpenAI because this is like the biggest name and they heard good things about them and they just stay there?
Again, right, I think it really depends on the use case, and it's very hard to say generally. But to make a point here, I think reputation matters quite a bit. And, at the end of the day, what's branding? Branding is helping you to make a choice easier. Yeah. And of course, like when it comes to software, and when it comes to cybersecurity, and when it comes to more conservative corporates, companies, larger organizations, if you were to go with a bigger company or bigger vendor, the chances that this gets approved gets much higher. And also, I think the second thing is when you deal with larger companies and organizations, you normally have a procurement team, you need to be registered as a vendor, and you need to do pen tests and really make sure that your security is on par with what the company requires. And so for that, a lot of startups or smaller companies are struggling to actually get into these bigger corporates, just simply because of the processes that they have to go through, or it just takes simply 6 months to 9 months to actually sell something. Whilst if you were to just go to like an SME or another startup and you sell them something, it's much, much easier.
Yes, indeed. It's always, so we go back to this topic of nobody gets fired for buying IBM. And it seems that also in the AI world is, so this being a truth that is holding. So let us recap. So what do we discuss today? What did we learn today? Well, first, we had here Salesforce with Mark Benioff saying, now we're becoming AI agent company, to the point that they're doing now an Agent Force world tour to showcase their agent capabilities to their client base. We're also seeing how companies, they need to become more here AI driven, but nevertheless, regardless if they're building a model or they're just building an application on top, it's becoming more expensive. And we're hearing here quotes that now to build new models, you require at least 1 billion, which seems exorbitant for most companies, no matter where they're based. We're exploring how some of these costs might be mitigated if, for example, you run this in China, but still the question is, should you do this in China? And then it's also the topic of maybe you just use AWS or an established player because this is what is approved. And also the same applies for the topic of like rankings and so on. Rankings are nice, but if in the end OpenAI is the one that gets, so here the approval from your board, well, this is the one to choose. So with this, we have covered a lot of topics for this week. As usual, remember to like, subscribe, leave your comments. We always answer to your questions. We always get very happy when you put a like, when you share and so on. And let's reconnect next week for another episode of the Chris Rod Max Show. Until next time.